I'm delighted to welcome Edgar Beltran, who is the Rome correspondent for The Pillar. The Pillar is a source of news on the Catholic Church, providing serious, smart, and faithful Catholic news and analysis, and it's available on Substack. Edgar, thanks so much for joining One Nation Under God on NewsNation.
It is my pleasure. It is my pleasure.
So, no doubt you have been following the events unfolding in Venezuela with bated breath. Let's start briefly with just your background. Where are you from in Venezuela, and when and why exactly did you leave?
Okay. So I come from Maracaibo, Venezuela, which is where traditionally in Venezuela the oil comes from. As probably a lot of people know, Venezuela is an oil-rich country. So I come from the capital of the state where oil comes from. I come from an oil family. My grandfather worked in the oil industry. My mom worked in the oil industry. I have an uncle who works still now in a different country, but still works in the oil industry. Um, which is the story of so many of us in my city. I lived there. I'm 28 years now. I live in Venezuela until I was 25. Um, I originally, even though I had thought of leaving for quite a while, because even though I had never received threats directly until that time, a part of me didn't want to wait until I received a threat because I had so many friends having issues, etc. And of course, because I had gotten married and had one son, it's a different thing thinking on yourself suffering the consequences of socialism in your country, suffering from the bad situation in the hospitals, from power cuts, lack of gasoline, shortages in food, etc. And it's a different thing when you're thinking of your children suffering it. So I think that
Yeah, of
that
course.
actually pushed me to leave the country. I got a scholarship to do to get a master's degree in philosopher. Um, but I work as a journalist because, well, philosophy it's has a lot of it's a bit difficult to find a job as a philosopher sometimes. So but I did a master's in philosophy in the Netherlands. I got a scholarship, so I went with my wife and my son. Then our daughter was born in the Netherlands. But then, of course, repression started to get increasingly worse in the country. So it's not that Venezuela was under a brutal dictatorship, but Maduro is smarter than one imagines. So there was always like targeted repression. For example, very wide repression in moments of big protests in the country, like 2014 and 2017, in which we had massive protests, in which there were thousands of people who became political prisoners, thousands of exilees, and in these two series of protests, together about 100 people who were killed in protests. Um, but then with high profile people, they were targeted even outside the protest. But if you were not like a very famous person, etc., you could go. I mean, it was there was, let's say, a 50-50 chance whether you got threatened or not. I didn't receive that, but then that started to change. That started to change, especially after the 2024 presidential election. um, all of my friends who were journalists, who were political analysts, who were political activists still in the country had to leave, especially after the election. There was a huge crackdown on dissent in the country. And not only against political activists or politically active people. There has been many cases of people who have been imprisoned and charged with hate crimes, with conspiracy, because they shared a meme against Maduro on WhatsApp. There's a
Wow.
very particularly iconic case, which is a family of three, in which a mother and her two children were imprisoned because precisely because they shared a meme about Maduro or a video or something in their WhatsApp group, and we're laughing and we're talking about their opposition to the government. And a few hours later, I think it was one of the children was stopped by the police at a police checkup point, because there are checkup points all over the cities in the country, and they asked for his phone. They checked he had this, so they took him into prison. They took his mother and his sister to prison. So this is how bad it has gotten. So of course, even though I didn't leave for political reasons, the country for I actually went back a couple of times when I was abroad, and now it's impossible for me to return, because and then I in Venezuela I also worked with a very high profile politician which is now in jail for conspiracy. A very good Catholic man, actually. We can talk about him in this program. And then, as you know, and some people know, back in October, we had a great joy in Venezuela, which was the canonization of the two first Venezuelan saints. But 2 days before the canonizations, I was trying to do an interview with a Venezuelan bishop, and a member of the government delegation didn't like the questions I was asking here in Rome. I mean, not even in Venezuela, in Rome. I'm talking about a country in the European Union. I mean, it's simply ridiculous that this happened. And a member of the Venezuelan government delegation didn't like my questions, so he proceeded to attack me, tried to take out my recorder, grab me by my shirt. There was a very ugly situation. So of course, it's certainly not safe for me to return to the country. But now we're hopeful that maybe we can spend a Christmas in freedom this year back home.
Yeah, of course, of course. So for our viewers who may be just catching up, on January 3rd, the United States launched a military operation to remove Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. The operation included military strikes and also special forces. It was called Operation Absolute Resolve, and it was successful. They removed Maduro and his wife, Cilia, flew them to New York, and they now face charges of narco terrorism, drug trafficking, and weapons offenses. So, Edgar, what went through your mind when you heard the news on January 3rd?
Well, for in Venezuela, it was 2 a.m. in the morning, but here in Rome was about 7 a.m. I remember my wife waking me up saying that Trump is attacking Caracas. And I was like, oh, my goodness, she just woke me up at 7 a.m. And I'm sure it's some AI video. That was my first reaction, until she put her phone on my face and was like, no, it's for real. And I woke up and I started writing to my family and friends back home, As I said, my family is not from Caracas, it's from Maracaibo. Caracas is like in the north and exactly like in the middle of the country, but in the north, and Maracaibo is the west, next to the border with. My family was not at any risk whatsoever. Actually, I called my mom and I woke her up, like she didn't know anything that was going on. Then a lot of my friends in Caracas have been woken up by the bombings, because some of the military targets were near residential areas. So of course, a lot of people were very close to the bombings. Thankfully, it was a very surgical operation. So far, there's only been 2 civilian casualties confirmed. Sadly, a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, a few people lost their houses. I've seen a lot of people. It was very beautiful to see also in Venezuela, a lot of people doing GoFundMes and going to these people's houses to not only help them with the basic stuff like clothing or food, but actually trying to help them rebuild their homes. It's actually very beautiful. I've seen that online. But of course, everyone was like, what's happening, And then there was, I remember that a lot of people had videos of helicopters over Venezuela. So a lot of people were like, okay, so this means this also has a ground dimension, They're having boots on the ground. But no, I think no one imagined that the U.S. was actually capturing Nicolas Maduro until President Trump announced it. Like, I mean, not even in my wildest dream, I would have thought that was happening or that would have happened, But it was what happened. So of course, actually, people felt like insane level of joy, because we thought, well, maybe it's a first bombing at the beginning. It's just a warning for Maduro to see if he leaves power or something. But then when we saw that Trump said that he had captured him, it was like, okay, this is for real, And like our first reaction was asking ourselves, like, are we free now, finally, And of course, it's a moment of a lot of emotions. And you think everything's over, like Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize Award winner, they're going to be back in the country and rule the country. We're going to be a democracy and all that. But reality is always more complicated, Of course, when President Trump and Secretary Rubio announced that there was going to be a transition, but very slow, led by Maduro's VP, Delcy Rodriguez, it was very unclear. Trump was very confusing in this press conference, as he usually is, Then in the next few days, I think we've gained some clarity in that regard. So I think that it was a bit difficult for Venezuelans to see, like, okay, this is going to be messy. It's probably gonna be long. Probably, we're gonna have to really take a deep breath. There are things that we're not gonna like, but at least me, I'm also a political scientist. I work in politics in Venezuela, and after an initial displeasure, after being angry for like an hour, I took a deep breath and I was like, okay, I mean, I think I see the reasoning behind it. It's reasonable to think that Venezuela, you cannot simply put Edmundo Gonzalez, who was a presidential candidate in 2024, and Maria Corina Machado, who's the leader of the opposition in Caracas, and say, you're the president and the vice president, now see what you're going to do, Like, that's not realistic. And that's precisely the kind of mistake that the U.S. made in many countries in interventions like in Iraq or Afghanistan, which is not understanding the reality on the ground. And reality on the ground, unfortunately, is that the country can be ruled without some participation of Chavismo, of the government, basically. Why? Because they control the military. Venezuela has more generals than the whole of NATO. Not only more generals than the U.S., but NATO in full.
Yeah, several countries. Yeah, the whole.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, more generals than the U.S., Canada, and almost all of Europe. It's crazy to think. Why? Because generals control parts of the economy. Some generals are involved in drug trafficking. Some are involved in arms dealing. Some are involved in illegal mining. Some are involved in the distribution of grain. Some are involved in the distribution of cement for building. Some are involved in the distribution, or also in illegal oil dealings. So all these generals have different parts of the economy. Some legal, some not legal. Some legal but conducted in illegal ways. So of course this is the base of power of Maduro, and without this base of power, you cannot rule the country, basically. So of course this makes it very complicated for the opposition, because of course the opposition is coming with a promise of ending the system, so of course having some participation of the government was necessary. So I think a lot of, and then there was a very good announcement yesterday, which was the release of a number of political prisoners.
Yes.
The government didn't say how many. They said it's going to be a big number, they said. The rumor was around 400. Venezuela now has around 1,200 political prisoners, so about 1/3 of the political prisoners, depending on the count. But then actually, the announcement was made. A lot of the families were told that their family member who's a political prisoner would be released. But in the end, only 11 political prisoners have been released. So this speaks about an internal struggle within Chavismo, that are probably the most radical faction of Chavismo, led by Diosdado Cabello, who's called by the U.S. the leader of the Cartel de los Soles, so basically the drug cartel that operates behind the curtain in Venezuela through the Venezuelan government. He's the leader of this most radical faction of the government. He's the Ministry of Interior, so he controls the police, the intelligence service, etc. And apparently he's the one, and also the Minister of Defense, called Vladimir Padrino Lopez. They're the ones who are resisting releasing the prisoners, the political prisoners, because that will bring hope for people, of course, and that would mean for people the end of the repressive apparatus, or the repressive structure of the government in Venezuela. So it could actually lead people to the streets, because the only reason why people don't go to the streets to protest is because they're going to be taken to prison or shot at a protest. But of course, releasing almost a significant number of political prisoners, so people, so we can go to the streets and we can protest, So there's this internal struggle from one part of the regime saying, no, we won't release these political prisoners, we won't cooperate with the U.S., and the other saying we need to do it simply because of survival, because if we don't do it, the U.S. might strike again. The U.S. might. President Trump said in his message celebrating the release of the prisoners, he said that we were ready to conduct a second strike, but now we're going to stop it, for now. So it's certainly a very tense tension within the government right now.
So it's a sign that it's going to be a long road, and that there's some tension within the remaining Maduro government. So do you think, as I understand it, U.S. officials are arriving in Venezuela to negotiate with Delcy Rodriguez and the other remaining officials, correct?
Yeah, it's something very interesting because yesterday or the day before yesterday, I'm not exactly sure. The Venezuelan government had announced that interim president Rodriguez would go to Colombia to meet President Petro of Colombia. This was just a day after President Petro spoke with Trump on the phone. So it was about some sort of negotiation probably. And today there were a lot of rumors indicating that the Venezuela government had contacted the U.S. government to have Delcy Rodriguez go to the U.S. and meet President Trump, because then the leader of the opposition, Maria Corina Machado, is meeting President Trump next week. President Trump himself said so. And there were rumors that apparently the U.S. would grant also this meeting to Rodriguez. But then today, just a few hours ago, a spokesman for the president in Venezuela said that Delcy Rodriguez wouldn't leave the country. She wouldn't. She had too much to a domestic agenda that was too complicated or too big. They said to be traveling abroad. Of course, this also speaks a bit about the instability in the country, because this might mean that she fears a possible coup. That
Yeah.
she fears that her leaving the country might bring more instability to the government. So even though they had just announced a day earlier that she would go to Colombia to meet Petro. So of course, what is now happening is that there are U.S. officials in Venezuela, and apparently the two main topics of discussion here, at least the ones that have been leaked to the press, are one, oil deals between Venezuela and the U.S. The U.S. has seized a lot of Venezuelan oil. So what exactly is going to happen with that? And the U.S. has repeatedly said, and I've been told by U.S. officials directly, that a good part of that oil is supposed to go back to Venezuela. But of course, I'm guessing the discussion will be a lot about how will that mechanism go to guarantee that the oil is simply not stolen by the government or used by the government to buy more weaponry, for example, or to continue fueling its drug trafficking operation, etc. So I'm guessing that's going to be that's one of the focus of the discussion. And the other is reopening an American embassy in Venezuela, which has been closed for a number of years right now.
Okay. So I want to go back, take a step back, and can you share with our viewers what life is like for ordinary Venezuelans in terms of, we see a lot of things on social media, but
Yep.
firsthand, what is life like? What is life like for ordinary Venezuelans in terms of food, electricity, outages, just day-to-day life? And how a family gets by in today's Venezuela.
So I can tell you about my personal experience. I come from a pretty middle class family, so I didn't experience nowhere near the worst that many people experience. Um, I power cuts, for example, 2019 in March, we had a 5-day power cut, followed by a 6-day power cut. No, by a 2-day power cut, followed by a 6-day power cut, which means like in March 2019, we didn't have electricity for half of the month, basically. And I live in a city that has think of it like Phoenix weather all year long, Phoenix summer all year long. That's
Very,
that's
very,
that's
very
Maracay.
hot. Yeah.
Yeah, very very hot, humid. I mean, it's impossible to live without air conditioning. You lost all of your food because, of course, after 5 days. I mean, I remember that my neighbors doing giant barbecues, not because they were enjoying their life, just because they didn't want to waste the food.
Yeah.
Because if not, it would have gone bad, and they would have had to throw it away. So they just you making giant barbecues, eating as much as they can, and giving away to people also, because if not, you just simply waste your food. Um, so we had this, and after this power cuts ended for a whole year, almost a whole year, like 10 months, I remember, we had 6-hour power cuts. We had 6-hour churns, basically, of electricity. Basically, you didn't have electricity from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. Then you had electricity from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. And then you didn't have electricity again from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. Like, it's absolutely crazy. It's impossible to work. It's impossible to study. It's impossible to live. Imagine people who are dependent on who have kidney problems and need to be connected to a machine all the time, or people with breathing problems, and they need to do breathing therapy, or people with small children. Like 2 days after my son was born in 2022, 2021. Sorry, my wife is gonna is gonna say something about me, say something to me about this. So my son was born in September 2021, and 2 days after he was born, we had a power cut all night in my city. It's, I mean, if that's difficult enough, imagine with a newborn. That his belly button's still healing. And my wife was, I mean, he had just given birth. She still had. I mean, it was horrendous. I have to say, it was one of the worst nights of my life. Like, it's crazy. Gasoline. And then in Venezuela, the situation depends a lot on between cities. Usually cities that are closer to Caracas are slightly better, and Caracas especially does a little better in this regard. But for example, there was at one point that my mom did a almost 3 day line to be able to fill the gas tank. And we're talking about an oil country, an oil-rich country, but the government has simply destroyed the oil industry. So this is another aspect. Then the insecurity, I didn't notice this wasn't weird until this was weird, sorry, until I live in the Netherlands, which is in Venezuela, you get used to when, say you have some beers with friends and then everyone goes home, you get used to write to everyone, hey, let me know when you arrive well, or if they don't reply back in half an hour, you get worried and you call them like, hey, are you okay? Did you arrive well? Did nothing happen to you? So when I started doing this with my Dutch friends, when I lived in the Netherlands, and they were like, dude, are you okay? Like, that's necessary, etc. I noticed like, oh, this is not normal, Because
Yeah.
of course in Venezuela, at some point, kidnappings were so common. There are a lot of criminals on the street,
So
at
a lot of
point,
crime, a lot
we had
of petty
the
theft.
highest homicide rate in the world at some point. Now it's not the highest, but still, I think we're in the top 10 at least, About food. Thankfully, the scarcity situation in the country has gotten better because, especially with the pandemic, the government was forced to take some liberalizing measures with the economy. So we didn't have a scarcity anymore because there weren't price controls anymore. Basically, that's the main reason, but we had a lot of scarcity in between, I would say, 2013, 2019. And once my mom was hit in the face for one chicken, because she was in the line outside in the supermarket. Chicken arrived and everyone went crazy and someone hit her in the face, and I remember my mom almost every day. This was when I was studying at the university. I still live with her and with my grandparents, and I remember that every day, almost every day, after she left work at 5 p.m., she would go to the supermarket because one day was the day that they would give you 2 bags of flour. One day was the day that they would give you a chicken. One day was the day of the toilet paper and the milk, So you have to be there every single day to be able to get some of the food, I remember there was
rationed out.
Yeah, there
right?
was rationing, etc. Exactly.
Okay.
You still had to pay for it, of course, but you could only access a limited number. I remember there was a system in which you had to put your fingerprint, so it showed in the system if you had already bought too many of a specific product. There was a black market of basic products. Like there was a small bodegas in which you went and you could buy a flour freely, but it was probably 3 times the price than in the supermarket. Thankfully, we had some family abroad that could help us a bit, so we could pay the black market price. Not always, but sometimes, But there were people who weren't as lucky, There were people who weren't as lucky. I would say another aspect of life right now in Venezuela is that big parts of cities just feel like ghost towns because everyone has left the country, Like the street in which my other grandmother, so my paternal grandmother used to live, it's pretty much empty. Like it was a street with maybe 20 houses, and there are now maybe 3 occupied. The rest are empty. And maybe there's a family member that goes every now and then just to check that no one stole anything, nothing happened, but some have been abandoned, and criminals have gone and taken the doors, the windows, just to sell them in the black market or sell them as trash, basically. Like it's a crazy situation. Yeah. And everyone in Venezuela has family members abroad. In my dad's side of the family, I think I have one cousin that remains in the country, and it's a big family. My dad has 4 siblings. So.
Anyone who could leave at this point has left. I think I read it's like between 25% to a third of the Venezuelan population.
We're a country. we're a country of about 28 million, and 8 million have left. So it's a bit more than 25%. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
And this is between 2013 mostly and now that
now
people are actually start to migrate in large groups.
in large numbers. Okay.
Yeah.
And President Trump has said that the United States is will run Venezuela until there's a safe transition, right? How do you feel about that, and how are Venezuelans viewing the fact that the U.S. is looks like the U.S. is going to try to run the country?
Well, it's a sad development, but the culprit has a name, and that's Nicolas Maduro. Nicolas Maduro sold and Hugo Chavez before him sold our country to Cuba, to China, to Russia, to Iran. Like, we Venezuelans had always said that the Cuban military officials had infiltrated into the Venezuelan military. The Chavez and Maduro had welcomed them, and we were called crazy for years. A lot of people didn't hear us or tried to downplay it. And in the operation, and on January 3rd, 90 soldiers were killed in the operation, and by the Cuban government's own admission, 32 of them were Cuban. 32 of them, a third of
Right.
them.
Even though Maduro had insisted that it was a lie, he called it a lie that there were Cubans, infiltrating the military. In interviews, like, he was on camera saying that, as well as Cuba denied it.
I think that's a 2015 interview in which he denied it.
Yeah.
So that shows you the extent of the Cuban involvement in Venezuela. There's always been also a lot of discussions about the Cuban G2, which is the intelligence service in Cuba, being infiltrated, being in Venezuela, and training the Venezuelan intelligence service, the SEBIN. Then there's also a lot of Russian presence of also military contractors who train Venezuelan armed forces. A lot of the Venezuelan anti-air systems were Russian. Now we know that they didn't work that well, definitely. But Venezuela invested a lot of money in those in those systems to defend themselves from airstrikes. Russian quality, definitely. Then China has a lot of investments in oil, in mining in Venezuela. Iran has also an economic presence in mining and oil, but also through Hezbollah. There's a former minister who's now in prison in Venezuela because he fell out of favor with Maduro. Where back in the day, he at some point was vice president, at some point minister of interior, at some point minister of oil. And when he was minister of interior, was found out that he was given Venezuelan passports to numerous citizens from Arab countries like Syria, Lebanon, and also Iran, which is not an Arab country, but and many of these people were connected to Hezbollah.
Wow.
Then these men, the groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., are intimately connected with drug cartels in Latin America. And this man called Tarek El Aissami, you can look for him. Tarek El Aissami used to be vice president, used to be minister of interior. He was also the link of drug dealing operations of Arab terrorist, Muslim terrorist groups, Islamic terrorist groups in Latin America, connecting him with cartels. Usually through money laundering was the main thing that he helped them do. Then also Venezuela became a place to recruit for Hezbollah, more specifically. So the links are there, are very real, they exist. So I mean, is Trump violating our national sovereignty? Our national sovereignty has been violated repeatedly in this last 27 years. It's a very difficult. I mean, would we be just not under, let's say, American tutelage or something? Yeah, it would be preferable that we could decide our own destiny, but it's not realistic. Right now, it's unfortunately not realistic to think that simply we will put Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez in power and everything will do fine. And then, of course, Trump has spoken a lot about the oil, and the main criticism from a lot of people, especially on the left, is that this is just about the oil. The oil has to do with it, of course. Let's be realistic. It goes beyond that because of all these links I've spoken about with enemies of the U.S. and terrorist groups. But then also, look, the government destroyed our oil industry. Just to give you one example, my state, Zulia State, used to produce at its highest point almost 1 million barrels of oil a day. Almost 1 million barrels of oil a day. Right now, my state produces 10,000 barrels a day. 10,000. Wow. So it's just unthinkable that we can rebuild the oil industry by ourselves. We need foreign investment. We need foreign help for that. We need international companies coming to our country and helping us rebuild the oil industry. And I think that if you ask any Venezuelan whether they would prefer to have the U.S. and maybe European companies coming and investing in Venezuela, or have China, Russia, and Iran, every single one of them would say the U.S. and European companies. Absolutely, absolutely. And why? Because when we were a democracy between the 60s and the 90s, we were nationalized in Venezuela since 75. That's one big lie of the left and Chavismo. They say that Chavez nationalized the oil, and that's why the U.S. hated him. Oil had been nationalized in 1974. What we worked with was with joint ventures with Western companies, So we had our state company, oil company, PDVSA, and then a lot of joint ventures with Shell, ExxonMobil, all these Western companies that were actually mostly controlled by the Venezuelan government, but with a lot of goodwill, with a lot of good relationships, and it worked for the country. Poverty fell down enormously during the Venezuelan democracy, with the exception of the last few years, which were very corrupt, very difficult, and eventually brought Chavez to power
in the late 90s.
In the late 90s, exactly.
Because Chavez was elected in 98 and
1998.
And took power in 1999, and he was democratically elected.
Yeah. But because, of course, he didn't came there by coincidence. The Venezuelan political class before him was incredibly corrupt, was incredibly delegitimized in the country. There were a lot of petty political infighting that people just got tired of, and Chavez came as like this anti-system guy who would just kick them out and solve everything. So he was very popular at the beginning, definitely. But yeah, so that about the sovereignty issue, it's just about being realistic. We need help to rebuild our industry, or to just build it, because it's almost non-existent at this point. And I think everyone would say they prefer the U.S. to help us rebuild it than China or Russia. And oil is there to be sold. It's there to be sold. So it's better to sell it to the U.S. It's also closer to us. Oil in Venezuela is of the heavy or extra heavy kind, and not all countries have the kind of refineries that can process that oil. But the U.S. has them, because we were oil partners with the U.S. for 90 years, since oil was discovered in the early 20th century in Venezuela. So we're more than happy to have a good commercial relationship with the U.S. and use that oil to rebuild our country, definitely, and rebuild our oil industry too.
So generally, Venezuelans do not see this as a power grab, or sort of the U.S. trying to expand its, imperial power and grow. They generally are okay with this sort of, at least what, the like short-term help from the United States in terms of running the government.
I think a lot of Venezuelans are cynical about Trump's intentions. They do think that economic considerations or American interests are behind that. Like, they don't think Trump is doing this because he wants a democratic and free Venezuela, or he cares about human rights. Like, of course, if he can get a democratic government and do a good transition in Venezuela, that's going to make him popular and it's going to be good for him. But I think most Venezuelans wouldn't think that that's his priority in the country. But we're in a situation in which I think you don't stop to think about the motivations of the people who are willing to help you. So I think they're very helpful. They're very thankful for what President Trump is doing. A lot of people feared an American attack. I must say so. I think that a lot of people who were against an American attack, they were against because they thought it would fuel a civil war, or it will bring a lot of civilian casualties. Like even the for example, the U.S. intervention in Panama, which is, I would say, one of the most successful regime change operations that the U.S. has enacted, because Panama is actually now a very advanced democratic country and all that. It still ended up with a lot of civilian casualties and a lot of collective trauma because of the U.S. attack. So I think a lot of people feared this. But of course, after the operation happened, it was Very sad still that two civilians lost their lives, but certainly was not the massive loss of life that many feared could come. Now, about the civil war, I mean, I don't think there's a civil war is going to happen, but of course, there's going to be a lot of instability. So people are still quite fearful of the possibility of the government breaking down, especially what has happened in last couple of days. Like the government announces release of political prisoners doesn't happen. The government announces that the president will go to Colombia. Then a day later, they say they won't. That means they haven't convinced everyone within the ruling party. So that's certainly a source of concern for a lot of people. But I think with how the cooperation was conducted, really calmed the fear of a lot of people in Venezuela who thought that this might be a prolonged military conflict with a lot of loss of civilian deaths.
So, Edgar, give us a little sketch of what it was like for Venezuelans over the last 27 years to exercise their political rights. You mentioned earlier that it wasn't always a brutal dictatorship. It got more severe in recent years. But just can you give us a snapshot? Were people able to vote? Did people try to influence your vote? How did political rights work in Venezuela in this last 25 years?
They didn't. So I would say Chavez, in a way, he didn't commit fraud. He was popular, but in a way, I mean, he didn't commit fraud as in he added votes or stuff like this. There's a lot of rumors about it, but I think the opposition has never been able to prove this. But he, for example, he disbarred many candidates for running, used the public media for his campaigns, forced public employees to go to pro-government marches and to vote for the government. There was a very famous situation in which the Venezuelan constitution allows for a recall election. Basically, that around the middle of the presidential term, if you collect enough signs from Venezuelan citizens, then you can do a recall in which people can say if they want to kick out the president or not, and if they kick him out, there's a new election with two different candidates. Back in the early 2000s, Venezuelans tried this. I remember a big operation called El Firmazo. So it's difficult to translate that, but it's like the signature, or the signature event, the big signature. Yeah, something like that. Which is they were collecting signatures for this, But then when you had to sign, which means your name appears there, it's not an anonymized process, and then this was used. Then we went to a recall, but the opposition lost the recall. But then the list of people calling for a recall was called to find who were the public servants who were against the government and fire them. My mom was one of them because she worked in the oil industry, in the public oil company in Venezuela. But thousands and thousands of people lost their jobs, especially in the oil company, which had some of the best engineers, some of the best people to lead the oil industry in a country. They lost their jobs. They were fired from their jobs just because they opposed the government. And now they're doing great job for oil companies in the U.S., in the Netherlands, and in the Middle East, But then this marked people. So a lot of public employees, even though they opposed the government, they voted for the government because they feared they would lose their jobs. There were always a lot of intimidations. In 2008, one TV channel that was very critical to the government was closed. The TV channel is called RCTV, so RCTV, because Chavez didn't like them. Another very critical government was bought by a government-connected businessman, while the two remaining big TV channels in the country simply got quieter, because of what was happening. The government controlled the importation of paper for newspapers, and they at some point stopped giving paper to the newspapers that were critical to the government. So they went out of business or became simply digital. What else can I say? I mean, it's and then of course, so I would say elections, like the election itself in Venezuela during Chavez the elections themselves, where the vote you were making was being counted, but of course the circumstances were simply not free. There were always in the elections the government threw the colectivos in the street. The colectivos are paramilitary groups, that they have armed civilians that they send to the streets to get people scared.
To
So they
police,
send them
like
in the
sort of like
elections so
a,
people
yeah.
wouldn't go vote, or so people couldn't go to see the votes being counted, or get the tally sheet of the votes and stuff like this. Then, of course, when Maduro comes into power, he's very unpopular. He wins an election a month after Chavez died, which was very contentious. He won by 1% of the vote. A lot of Venezuelans think he didn't win the election. A lot of countries say that they were concerned about the legality of the election. And the voting system starts changing. Actually, they use a different. The voting in Venezuela is fully electronic, but they start using a different company, a different software, and that's where things get quiet. But then, of course, also at this point, people just stop voting in Venezuela because they don't see the point, basically. So, of course, at the same time, there's not a trustworthy system. At the same time, people are simply not voting. Then, of course, Maria Corina Machado has always been one of the most popular leaders of the opposition. The rest of the major leaders of the opposition had gone into exile or had already had like their chance in the spotlight had failed. So, of course, when Machado wins the primary of the opposition, the government says she can't run.
And that was in 2023, correct?
Yeah, 2023 she wins the primary. 2024 is the election. The government says she can't run. But then, of course, a lot of people didn't think it was going to be a legitimate election, but because she's the leader, people see her as a coherent person, as a person who has never given a gesture of being in favor of the government or of being weak with the government. People were like, well, let's give it a chance. If this is the way, this is the way. So let's give it a try. So a lot of people voted. And then there was a significant operation to collect the tally sheets from every electoral center. So we had the proof that we had won. This is what the opposition did. We were able to collect about 80% of the tally sheets, which gives you a significant tendency. 80% it's quite a significant number. And this 80% shows that Edmundo Gonzalez won the presidential election. Edmundo Gonzalez was the man who became the candidate after Maria Corina was not allowed to run. He's a former diplomat. So Edmundo Gonzalez won with 67% of the vote, whereas the government announced that Maduro had won the election with 54% of the vote. That was the result they gave. Also, for example, another thing that they have done is infiltrating political parties. So they basically get people. They corrupt or threaten people, get them to turn and support a government within the parties. And it happened more than once that they fight for the leadership of a party. They contest an election. They said an election within the party was not legitimate, etc. They take it to the Supreme Court. And of course, the Supreme Court sides with the pro-government faction of the party. So we have let's say a controlled opposition in the country. And in Venezuela, people call them the Los Alacranes, which is like the scorpions, because they're connected to the government. And so pretty much every single party that existed in Venezuela is now, it has been illegalized, but has a legal version that it's a controlled opposition version of the party, which is people who mildly criticize the government, but dedicate more time of their lives to criticize the opposition than the government, basically, and who had a lot of dealings with the government, who some of them have been sanctioned by the U.S. precisely because they participate in acts of corruption with the Venezuelan government. So this is also another thing that the Venezuelan government started doing in the late part of the last decade. Yeah.
So total repression of political, the exercise of political rights and, participation in the political system, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
So the majority of Venezuelans are Catholics, and the Catholic Church has, while cautious, has been vocal in their opposition of the abuse of human rights by the Maduro government and turning away from democracy and the suppression of freedom, essentially. Tell us how the Maduro government treated the Catholic Church, the Catholic faithful, like above all people, the Catholic, regular people who are trying to practice their faith, and other groups. There is a small Jewish population in Venezuela, and any people of faith. How did Maduro see faith communities in terms of did they repress them, and how did the Catholic Church react?
So even though the Venezuelan government is a hard left, far left government, they are not your typical Marxist government in which the government is atheist and persecutes religion just because of the sake of religion. It's not like
not
that.
Like the Cuban, not like Castro's regime.
Not like Cuba used to be. Yes, exactly. So Chavez always says he was Catholic. He obviously took a very liberation theology type of interpretation of Catholicism. Like he said that Jesus was the first socialist and stuff like this. But he always had a very bad relationship with the church. It's very important to understand a bit of the historical context of the Venezuelan church. As you know, the church in Latin America didn't have a great record of siding with democracy during the Cold War. A lot of the church was widely accused many times of supporting military dictatorships, of being close to military dictatorships and stuff like this. But in Venezuela, we had two dictatorships in the 20th century, and the church opposed both very strongly. So actually, the second one, which was in the 50s, the dictatorship of Marco Pérez Jiménez, was overthrown after a long months of protests, which started after a pastoral letter of the Archbishop of Caracas, the capital city, in which he criticized the situation of labor and corruption in the country. So the church has this in the imaginary of the church, standing with human rights, standing with freedom, standing with people is very important. Historically has been like this, and this also means that even though you said rightly so that most Venezuelans are Catholic, it's also true that most Venezuelans are cultural Catholics, which means they don't really go to church. There's still a significant minority of people who go to church. But most Catholics in the country don't really go to church. They baptize their children. They might take them to a Catholic school. We're not really churchgoers, or they don't really believe every single thing that the Catholic Church teaches. But there's a very strong sense of cultural Catholicism, like in feasts, and in the imaginary, in the respect for priests and for bishops and for religious sisters, and in being grateful for the church, for the social role of the church, because the church has a big role in education, in health, and in the defense of human rights. So if you do in every single poll that they do in Venezuela about institutions, about their popularity, their legitimacy, the church always comes on top. It's on top of the government, of the opposition, of the military, of business people, and universities. Usually the church on top, and then the universities, and then business people, actually. Very interesting.
Wow. So the church is very trusted.
Yeah, very, very much so. Very much so. And even for example, in the years that of the Francis pontificate, this is another completely different discussion. But Francis certainly wasn't very strong in criticizing the Venezuelan. Why is a different discussion, not for now. But certainly didn't say much, in this moment of protest in Venezuela, etc. But even so, the people never said never criticized the bishops, and they were in favor, and the bishops were still very much criticizing the government, defending human rights, and then Pope Francis said that the voice in the bishops in Venezuela is my voice too, So it was not like there was a tension between the bishops and Francis, but certainly people knew how to differentiate Francis's silence with the bishops. It's not that they got connected; like people still supported and loved and revered and defended the Venezuelan bishops. Then, of course, how does Maduro treat the church? Very badly. But then, of course, because of how popular the church is in Venezuela, how respected the church is in Venezuela, at the same time, the government fears the church. And then the church is the only institution in the country that has legitimacy between all actors in the country. So it's the only institution that can negotiate, that can help the parties negotiate. Also at a very local level, because there are towns that are controlled by drug gangs or by guerrilla groups, Colombian guerrilla groups, especially in the border between Venezuela and Colombia. The government cannot do anything in these towns, but the leaders of these groups, they talk with the church, and the church serves as a mediator. So that it's a very delicate, it's a very difficult thing for the government going all in against the church. But of course, Chavez and Maduro has criticized the church a lot. They've always said that they're siding with capitalism. They've tried to pit the church against Francis because, of course, they said that Francis, he's a socialist like ours, but the church supports capitalism and supports imperialism, which was, of course, a lie, very, very silly. But they tried to do this. The government, for example, at some point, I don't remember exactly which year, but at some point in the early 2000s, the church has a large educational network, which, according to the 1964 Concordat, namely the treaty that regulates the relationship between the church and state in Venezuela, the government partially funds these schools that the church runs. But then the Chavez at some point refused to continue funding these schools. And the church were like, okay, we'll do our best without you, that's it. And they continue doing so. Chavez eliminated the teaching of religion even in Catholic schools in Venezuela. Then on a practical level,
so Catholic,
you couldn't teach Catholic religion in Catholic schools.
So they could
legal.
They could just
so that was,
at a legal level.
That was the legal provision. That was a legal provision. Then the reality was different. I taught religion at a school in Venezuela. Okay, but you call it education and values, ethics. And no, I never heard of a school getting into trouble for doing that. But I mean, the gesture itself, it's very significant.
It's very strong.
I think actually for a year or so, some schools actually stopped teaching it. Then they saw that they had forgotten a bit or didn't care, and it eventually returned. But I remember that I technically, the course I taught wasn't called religion or wasn't catechesis or something. It was education and values. But the content was 100% Catholic. But then this happened, there was also a lot of criticism. Then there has been targeted threats against certain priests, certain bishops, I know it was something I didn't know of before when I lived in Venezuela, which is there are a significant number of Venezuelan priests who have left the country. I mean, they haven't been exiled. It's not like the government, I don't know, the Venezuelan police grabbed them and put them on a plane to leave the country, but they got threatened, they got issues, etc., and they got so tired. And their bishop just told them, "Look, go to the U.S., go to Spain. Let's send you to do a doctorate in Rome for a little while." And I've actually met a lot of priests who have left the country, especially in Spain and Rome. I know there's a few in the U.S. too. So this is something that's not talked about because it's nothing official. It's not that they're being accused of crime. It's not that they're being forced into exile. It's just that they got tired of the threats that they receive just because from the pulpit they defend human rights, or because they go to an opposition march, or something like that. So we've seen also situations in which churches have been vandalized. Like a few months ago, there was a church in a state in the center region of the country that was vandalized, and it said that it was vandalized with a graffiti saying that they were going to kill the priest. But it hasn't been a persecution as you see now in Nicaragua, for example, or as you saw in communist countries in the Cold War. Like that hasn't happened, thankfully, in Venezuela. But then also, for example, the Concordat that regulates the relationship between the Venezuelan state and the church allows the Venezuelan government to have veto power over episcopal appointments. Namely, when the Pope wants to appoint a bishop in Venezuela, a leading bishop, so an auxiliary bishop doesn't need permission, but like the bishop of a diocese, he needs permission of the Venezuelan government. Okay, the Venezuelan government has to say, yeah, you can appoint him.
Wow.
Interestingly enough, Chavez didn't veto any episcopal appointments that we know of. It's not that this is publicly announced, but usually you didn't see very long vacancies in any diocese, so it wouldn't. I don't think he did. But Maduro in the last few years started doing so. The most iconic case was that of Cardinal Baltasar Porras, and I'm going to talk a bit more about him just in a second. Cardinal Porras, he used to be the Archbishop of Merida, which is in the Andean region. and Pope Francis wanted to make him the Archbishop of Caracas, but the government refused his appointment. So then Francis, very intelligent as he always was, he saw there was a legal vacuum, which is that the Concordat doesn't say anything about apostolic administrators, which are bishops who temporarily take in charge of a diocese while a definitive appointment is made. Basically, let's say in secular terms, an interim bishop, So he was like, well, I mean, and canon law, even though that says that apostolic administrators are meant to be temporary, it doesn't say that an apostolic administrator can only be there for a year, 2 years, 5 years. So he's like, well, I'm going to make Porras the apostolic administrator of Caracas, and that's it. And he was an apostolic administrator for 5 years, which I think it's almost unheard of in the Catholic Church. Apostolic administrators for more than a year or a year and a half. I think it's something that doesn't happen. But then you saw that the government started playing with this, of simply, and there was another diocese in the country in which a bishop was also very outspoken against the government, and he was made the apostolic administration of this diocese for 2 years until the Vatican finally decided to make him a bishop somewhere else, just to at least have him as an actual bishop, But it's the tensions have grown, and I said I was going to talk about Cardinal Porras later, because he's been one of the leading voices of the Venezuelan bishops. There was an event here in the Lateran University before the canonizations of the 2 first Venezuelan saints in October, and there was an event, and Cardinal, the government delegation was there, and he spoke about releasing political prisoners. He said that the situation in Venezuela was morally unacceptable. Those were his exact terms: the lack of freedom, the lack of economic progress in the country, etc. There was a massive ovation, everyone standing up, but the government, of course. But the government didn't take this kindly in Venezuela. So, of course, when he returned to Venezuela, the first thing that happened was he was trying to travel to Isnotu, which is the town where Saint Jose Gregorio Hernandez, the saint that had just been canonized, was born. And the government simply told him, no, you cannot fly. They took down, they forced him to stay in a different, to stop the flight in a different city. He couldn't get to Isnotu. He had to get in a different city. Tried to continue the trip on a car. They also stopped the car, and he had to return to Caracas. And then just this was slightly before Christmas, I think, he was trying to fly to Spain to receive an award. And they said, no, you cannot leave the country, and your passport is canceled. Even though Cardinal Porras has a diplomatic Vatican passport, because he's a cardinal, and he has been an official representative of the Pope in various events, like in the Eucharistic Congress in Ecuador, for example. He was a representative of the Pope, so he's a diplomat, And but they told him, no, you cannot leave the country, even though you have a Vatican passport. They think, no, your passport is canceled, and if you continue insisting, we're going to arrest you. So Cardinal Porras is now in his house in Caracas, and he hasn't been able to leave the city. He can leave his house. It's not a house arrest or anything, but he hasn't been able to leave Caracas. He couldn't, just a couple of days ago, we had the consistory, which is the meeting of all the cardinals in the world with the Pope, and he couldn't come. He couldn't come.
Wow.
Simply.
That's incredible. Not only just the fact that he's, a high-ranking Catholic clergyman, but also like with a Vatican passport that you're taking on the Vatican. But so they tolerate the church unless you oppose, you publicly oppose the government, or you try to call on the government to restore freedom.
The thing is, like the bishops a few years ago, they used to speak a lot, even individually. Now, I think the way they have found to continue denouncing the situation while covering their backs a bit is just speaking as the bishops' conference. Namely, they publish a pastoral letter. It's not signed by. They know that because of all the things I've explained, the government won't arrest 30-something bishops, which is, I don't remember the exact number of bishops in Venezuela now, but they're 30-something. They won't arrest 30-something bishops for publishing a pastoral letter. So that reduces the risk for them. So now they don't speak that much individually, but as a bishops' conference, they do. They ask for the release of political prisoners, for example, before the canonizations. In the Christmas message, they criticize the situation in the country of lack of freedom, of the economic stagnation, etc. So they still speaking. And now you also asked me about other communities, faith communities. As you correctly said, there's a small yet influential Jewish minority living in Caracas. I mean, influential because a lot of Jewish people arrived after World War II in the country, as many other European nationals. A lot of them became very economically successful, and also were involved in politics. Not that many in politics, but a few of them are involved in politics, but they're not many. But of course, Chavez, with his left-wing mentality, accused the Jews about everything in Venezuela. Like he targeted very bitterly. A lot of them have left. Like I know some Jewish Venezuelans living in Israel, for example, or in the U.S. A lot of them have left because they were targeted. The businesses were targeted. They were attacked by colectivos, by these paramilitary gangs that the government has, of government supporters. So it's been since the Chavez, it has been very difficult to be a Jew, to be Jewish in Venezuela. Definitely.
So Chavez targeted the Jewish community
Yeah.
particularly.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah,
was
yeah, very early, very early. I remember when I was growing up as a child, when I was 7, 8 years old, listening to Chavez talking about la gente de apellido, so the people with the last names. That means the people with foreign surnames.
Wow. And what
And
was
he also spoke a
Chavez's
lot about the
logic?
Jews, and he once cursed the state of Israel, and
Yeah.
said that the state of Israel was supporting the Venezuelan opposition, the coup plotting Venezuelan opposition through the Jewish business people in Venezuela, stuff like this. Yeah.
So many Jewish Venezuelans also left the country.
Yeah.
Wow.
I wouldn't be able to tell you the exact numbers, but I know that's been very common. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Like one of them,
So
for example, one of the most famous Venezuelan economists. If he teaches, I'm not sure if in MIT or Harvard, is Professor Ricardo Hausman. He's a Jewish Venezuelan, and he's in exile in Venezuela. Exile outside of Venezuela. Sorry. Yeah.
outside of Venezuela. Wow. Okay. And Pope Leo expressed after the events of January 3rd, he expressed his deep concern about what was going on. He said that the good of the Venezuelan people should be taken into consideration. That should be the first priority, is the good of the Venezuelan people beyond political considerations. And he also, emphasized the importance of the sovereignty of Venezuela and, the path of justice and peace. So what do you make of his comments? Did he go far enough? And do you think that the Vatican could play a role in helping to establish, freedom and democracy in the country?
I think a lot of people in Venezuela would like Pope Leo to be more direct in denouncing the human rights situation in the country. I'm not so sure about that. I think the Venezuelan the church has an important role as a mediator in the Venezuelan situation, and it's playing it. I don't know if you saw that earlier today, the Washington Post published an article that say that there have been several meetings between. Well, there was one meeting between the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, Brian Birch, and Secretary of State Pietro Parolin. And the topic of the meeting was basically that Parolin was trying to convince the U.S. to give Maduro an ultimatum to self-exile himself in Russia and to be able to start a transition in Venezuela. So, of course, I think that the Vatican has a significant role in offering an easier option to the Venezuelan government or to Venezuelan government officials that don't want to Venezuela to be a democratic and prosperous society. And also that the Vatican has a way of offering guarantees to these people to tell, if the Vatican is telling you this, you believe it's true. You believe in it. It's an actual offer and it's an actual possibility. Of course, what happened that Maduro, he still thought, even though this negotiations, he thought that Trump was bluffing and he didn't prepare himself to be in exile, etc. And that's why the ended up happening. And also because the U.S. government, I think they didn't believe the guarantees that Maduro would live were enough. But then I think this is an important role, and then this role will be compromised if Pope Leo is seen to be taking sides too publicly. Now, I think it's good. A call for dialogue is good. It's a good thing. And then also not outright directly condemning the operation. It's a good thing too. Then today he also spoke to the diplomatic corps today, and he said two very important things, which is respecting the will of the Venezuelan people, which is all that we are asking for, to our will that we expressed in the 2024 election be respected. So I think that was fantastic. And to respect civil and human rights in Venezuela. There's been a long time since a Vatican official and the Pope has mentioned the term human rights in Venezuela. So it's very significant, I think.
So just to
Yeah.
clarify, so during Pope Francis's pontificate, he never mentioned, or he rarely mentioned human rights abuses in Venezuela?
Well, he spoke about finding peace, reconciliation, justice, but in a very two-sidism style.
Mm.
Then in one of his last, the Pope usually when he was returning from a trip gave a press conference in the airplane. In one of his last press conferences, I think was when he was returning from Belgium, I think, which was his next to last trip. He was asked about Venezuela, and he called Venezuela a dictatorship, and he said dictatorships always end badly. So I think he was clear about the situation on the ground, but perhaps he thought that speaking too loudly about it or too much about it would perhaps make the situation more difficult for the church in Venezuela. Yeah, I think that was the
Okay.
rationale behind Francis not speaking so much about the situation.
So clearly, yeah, he was
Yeah.
trying to be prudent, I guess, for a lot of different reasons. Well, Edgar, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate your time during a busy week when there was a major meeting at the Vatican with the Pope with all the cardinals from around the world. But I hope you'll come back again, and we can talk more.
Sure, it will be a pleasure for me. Thanks a lot for giving me the time to talk about my country and to really explain the situation as someone who experienced it and lived it and was on the ground for a long time. Yeah, thanks a lot.
We really appreciate it. Okay, all the best.
Thanks a lot.